Some betrayals arrive with shouting. Mine arrived quiet on a Wednesday afternoon. While I was recalking the tackle box shelf in a workshop my daughter thought she'd already emptied me out of. She was wrong. The phone buzzed against the workbench, her name lighting up the screen. I wiped the caulk off my thumb and answered. Dad, she said, we've talked it over. We're putting the diner up for sale. You've got until the 15th to clear out your things. But before I tell you how that call ended, you should know who you're listening to. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 68 years old, and for 41 years, I ran a lunch counter in a town called Mill Haven, Ohio, that most people driving through wouldn't remember by the time they hit the county line. But the ones who stopped for a slice of pie remembered. I want to tell you this whole thing properly, so bear with an old man who takes the long way around a story, the same way I used to take the long way around Mill Haven on my Sunday drives, just to see the corn get tall. I bought the building on Route 9 in the spring of 1985. Back then it was a boarded-up hardware store with a leaking roof and a rent so low the previous owner practically paid me to take it off his hands. My wife Doris thought I'd lost every bit of sense God gave me. A diner, Walter? In this economy? She said, standing in the dust with her hands on her hips, looking at me like I'd told her I was going to sail to the moon. I told her, give it 15 years, and if it's still a disaster, I'll go back to the plant and we'll never speak of it again. She rolled her eyes, but she also went out that same week and bought a used popcorn machine at an auction because that's who Doris was. She complained the whole way there, and then she'd fight you for the thing she was complaining about. We named it the Blue Wagon. After the old Ford pickup, I drove it home in pieces on. I gutted that hardware store with my own two hands over one brutal summer, laid the counter myself, wired half the place myself, even though the inspector about had a heart attack when he found out. Doris did the books. She had a mind for numbers that made my head spin. And for 4 decades, she kept that diner solvent through 2 recessions, a flood, and one very bad year involving a health inspector who did not like me personally. The Blue Wagon became the heartbeat of Millhaven. Every Friday fish fry, every Little League team's pancake breakfast, every graduation, every funeral luncheon after, people ended up in our booths with a cup of coffee that never ran dry. Doris and I raised 2 children in the apartment above that diner. My son Gary was born in 1979, and my daughter Renata came along 4 years after. They grew up smelling like bacon grease and coffee grounds, doing their homework at the counter after close, and I loved every second of it, even the parts that were hard. When Doris got sick in 2016, it was Renata who came home most. She'd drive in from Columbus every other weekend, sit with her mother in the back booth, the two of them going through old recipe cards like they were photographs. Gary came around less. Gary had always been the one reaching for something bigger than Millhaven, and I never held that against him. Not once, not even when it stung a little. Doris passed in January of 2018. The morning after her funeral, I stood behind that counter at 5 a.m. out of pure habit, and I nearly couldn't do it. But I did it anyway, because that diner was the last living thing that still had her fingerprints all over it, and I wasn't ready to let go of that. What I never told either one of my children, what I have never told a living soul, until right now, is that 8 months after we buried Doris, I bought a second property. But we'll get to that. By 2024, Gary was 45, on his 3rd career reinvention, this time some kind of consulting business that seemed to mostly consist of expensive dinners and a new truck every 18 months. He'd married a woman named Deb who wore her jewelry the way some men wear their opinions, loudly and often. Renata was 41, a school teacher, married to a decent enough fellow named Kurt who sold insurance and mostly kept his head down. Renata was the soft one, the one who hated conflict so much she'd rather agree with something she didn't believe than sit in an uncomfortable silence for 30 seconds. I loved my children. I need you to understand that before this story goes anywhere else, I love them the way you love something you built out of nothing but your own 2 hands and your late wife's stubbornness. But I had watched something shift in Gary over the years, slow as rust working through a fence post, until one day you look up and the whole thing's eaten through. It started, near as I can tell, about 2 years back, when Gary began asking questions that weren't really questions. Dad, you ever think about what happens to the Blue Wagon down the road? Or, Dad, That building's got to be worth something now. You know that, right? Route 9's not what it used to be. There's a whole shopping plaza going in past the Sunoco. I'd nod along. Same as I nodded along to most things, Gary said, and I'd go back to flipping eggs. Renata never asked those kinds of questions. Renata asked if I was eating enough vegetables and whether my knees were giving me trouble on the tile floor. But somewhere along the way, Gary got to Renata too. That's the part that still catches in my chest a little, if I'm honest with you. Not that Gary wanted the money. People want money. That's not a sin. That's just being alive in this country. What got me was that he talked his sister into believing it was the responsible thing to do. He had a way of dressing up greed in the clothes of practicality. And Renata, God love her, has never been able to tell the difference between the two when it's coming out of her brother's mouth. The Wednesday call came at 2:40 in the afternoon. I was alone in the workshop out back of the house, the one Doris used to call my cave, fixing up a tackle box hinge that didn't need fixing, just something to keep my hands busy on a slow day. Renata's name came up on the screen, and I felt something go tight in my stomach before I even answered. The way you know a storm's coming before the sky tells you. Dad, she said, and her voice had that careful, rehearsed quality, like she'd practiced this in the car. Gary and I have talked it over. We think it's time. We're putting the blue wagon up for sale. There's a broker, a friend of Gary's. He thinks we could get close to 400,000 for the building and the lot both. You've got until the 15th to get your personal things out. I set the pliers down on the workbench, real slow, the way you set down something you don't want to throw. Is that right? I said. Dad, don't make this hard. You're 68. You've been on your feet in that place since before I was born. Gary says the market's never going to be better than it is right now. And honestly, we could use the money too. With the girls' tuition coming up, and Gary's got some stuff going on with the consulting business. Renata, I said, did you sign anything? There was a pause. Too long a pause. Gary's friend, the broker, he already came by and looked at it. He said with your signature it's a quick process, maybe 6 weeks. Dad, we're not asking you to be homeless. We just think it's time to let it go. It's just a building. Just a building. I stood in that workshop, looking at a photograph of Doris pinned above my workbench, the one from the day we hung the blue wagon sign, both of us covered in sawdust and laughing, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear, the way water goes still right before it freezes. You said Friday, I said. Or was it the 15th? The 15th. Dad, are you even listening to me? I'm listening, I said. I'm listening real close, Renata. You go ahead and tell your brother. I heard him loud and clear. I hung up, not angry, not yet, just quiet. He called 40 minutes later, same as I knew he would, because Gary never could stand not being the one steering a conversation. Dad, look, I know Renata's not great at delivering news, so let me lay it out plain. The diner's a liability at this point. You know that. Foot traffic's down 30% since the highway bypass went in. You're one bad winter away from the roof caving in on you. And we both know you can't afford that roof. Deb's cousin does commercial real estate. And he ran the comps. And Dad, I promise you, this is the smart move. This is me looking out for you. You looking out for me, I repeated. That's right. And the 400,000, that's for my looking out for, is it? Or does that get split up some other way before I ever see a dime of it? Silence on the line. Just a half a second too long. Dad, don't twist it into something ugly. We're your kids. We have interests in this too. You always said the diner was for the family. I did say that, I said. I meant it too. So then help us out here. Sign the listing agreement, and we handle the rest. You keep whatever you want out of the place. The booth Mom liked, the register, whatever you want. We're not trying to erase her. We're just trying to be smart about the future. I looked out the workshop window at the backfield, the one that used to have a tire swing on it when the kids were small, and I said the only thing I had in me right then. I'll think about it, I said, and I hung up again. I want you to understand something about me, whoever's listening tonight, wherever you're driving or cooking dinner or lying in bed with this playing quiet beside you. I am not a man who does things in the heat of the moment. I am a man who plans. 41 years behind a lunch counter teaches you that the customers who shout the loudest usually leave the smallest tip, and the ones who sit quiet in the corner booth, taking it all in, they're the ones you watch. I had been watching my own son for 2 years. And 2 years ago, quiet as a Sunday morning, I had already started planning for exactly this Wednesday. The next morning, I didn't open the diner. First time in 6 years I hadn't opened on a weekday that wasn't a holiday. I called my nephew Petey, who works part-time flipping burgers for me on weekends and is more reliable than either of my own children ever gave him credit for, and I told him to hang the "closed for family matters" sign and to sit tight. I'd call him that evening. Then I drove out to see a man named Otis Reyes. Otis had been my lawyer for going on 30 years, ever since he handled the lease dispute back when the county tried to widen Route 9 right through my parking lot. Otis is a careful man, the kind who reads a contract twice, even when he wrote it himself. And he'd been telling me for 2 years. Every time I came in to update my will or ask him a hypothetical question about a friend of his who was having trouble with his kids, that I ought to think real hard about what I wanted the blue wagon to become after I was gone. "You remember the paperwork we drew up?" Otis said, once I'd sat down across from his desk and told him about the Wednesday call. "I remember," I said. "Then you remember Gary and Renata don't hold a single share of that building. Not one. You never put either one of their names on that deed, Walter. Not in 41 years. You talked about it plenty. You never did it." I sat with that a moment. It was true. I'd talked about signing the diner over to the kids more times than I could count. At Thanksgiving tables, and in the truck driving home from church, and every single time, something in my gut told me to wait one more year. 41 years of waiting one more year, and it turned out my gut had been right the whole time. "And the second building?" I said. "Cedar Street." Otis nodded slow. "Still sits in the trust, same as we set it up back in 18. Renata's name isn't on it. Gary's isn't either. Nobody's is, except the trust itself, and the trust doesn't answer to a broker's phone call. That second building. I'd bought it 8 months after we lost Doris. A squat little brick storefront 2 blocks off Main, the old five and dime that had sat empty since before my kids were born. I bought it quiet, paid cash I'd been setting aside for 15 years without telling a soul, not even Doris. God rest her, though I like to think she'd have approved. I never told Gary. I never told Renata. I fixed it up slow, over 6 years, mostly on Sundays, mostly alone, sanding floors and rewiring outlets in a building nobody in my family knew I owned. I called it nothing. It didn't need a name yet. It just needed to exist, quiet, waiting, the way I'd been waiting. "So he can't sell it," I said. "Even if I don't sign a thing, he can list it," Otis said. "A broker can put a sign in the ground and a listing on a website all day long. Doesn't mean a closing ever happens. No signature from the actual owner, no sale, full stop. Any broker worth his license knows that, or ought to, which tells me something about the broker Gary's using, and it isn't flattering." I sat there a long minute, looking at the diplomas on Otis's wall, thinking about Deb's cousin with his comps and his confidence, thinking about my son telling me this was him, looking out for me. "I want to let it play out," I said finally. "I want to see how far he takes it before he finds out." Otis leaned back in his chair and studied me the way he does when he's deciding whether to talk me out of something. "You sure about that? You could end this today. One phone call." "I could," I said, "but my boy needs to hear himself say it out loud, in front of people, before he understands what he's actually asking for. I've been quiet with him for 2 years, Otis. I think it's time I let him talk himself all the way to the edge." Otis nodded slow, the way a man nods when he's watched enough families come through his office to know exactly where this road usually ends. "All right then," he said. "Let's make sure the ground's solid under your feet when he gets there." 2 weeks passed, and in those 2 weeks I watched my son build a house of cards with a patience that honestly impressed me, even as it broke something in me a little more each day. He had Deb's cousin bring a photographer out to the Blue Wagon on a Tuesday morning, snapping pictures of my counter, my booths, the framed photo of Doris by the register, like it was already his to sell. I let him. I stood behind that counter and poured coffee for the regulars and let a stranger photograph 41 years of my life like it was square footage. Renata called twice that week, and both times I could hear something fraying in her voice, something that wanted to ask if this was really right, but couldn't quite get the words out from under her brother's certainty. "Gary says the listing's basically ready to go," she told me the second time. "He just needs you to come by Saturday and sign the paperwork." so we can lock in the price before the market shifts. Saturday, I said. All right. Dad, are you actually okay with this? Because if you're not, you can just say so. There it was. The door Renata always left cracked open, even when her brother was pushing hardest to close it. I could have walked through that door right then. Some part of me wanted to spare her, whatever was coming. But I'd learned something in 41 years of watching people eat breakfast. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for somebody is let them find out for themselves what they almost did. We'll talk Saturday, I said. All of us. Saturday came up gray and cold, the kind of Ohio morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just sit there sulking. I asked Gary to have the broker come out to the diner at 10, before we opened, so we could go over everything proper. Gary sounded thrilled. I could hear it in his voice, that particular lightness of a man who thinks he's already won. I called Petey the night before and asked him to come in early too, and to bring his cousin Anna, who does something with cameras for the county fair every summer and owed me a favor from a long while back. I didn't tell either one of them exactly why. I just told them to be there and to keep their phones charged. At 10 o'clock on Saturday, the blue wagon's front door chimed, and in walked my son in a coat that cost more than my truck, followed by a broker named Chip Halloran, a young fellow with a haircut like he'd stepped out of a bank commercial, carrying a leather folder full of papers. Renata came in a few minutes behind them, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth, and Kurt trailing behind her, hands in his pockets, saying nothing, the way Kurt says nothing about most things. Dad, Gary said, all warmth, spreading his arms like he was about to hug the whole diner. This is it. Chip's got the listing agreement. We go over the numbers. You sign where it says sign, and by summer, this place is somebody else's headache instead of yours. Somebody else's headache, I repeated. I let that sit in the room a second. Chip laid the folder on the counter and started talking numbers. Comps on Route 9, projected close date, his commission structure, all of it smooth as a man who's given this speech 100 times and never once had it go sideways on him. I let him talk. I let him get about 4 minutes into it, laying out the listing price, the timeline, the split. Now, hold on, I said, and I said it quiet, the way I say most things, which is usually the moment people in my diner know I'm dead serious. Before anybody signs anything, I've got a question, Chip, and I want you to answer it honest, because I imagine your license depends on it. Whose name is on the deed to this building? Chip blinked. Well, the seller's, obviously. Mr. Kessler, that's you. Is it? I said. You pulled the title before you brought a camera crew through my diner? I watched something flicker behind his eyes. The first crack of a young man realizing the ground under him might not be as solid as he'd assumed. The listing was based on ownership information provided by the family, he said. Careful now, choosing each word. Provided by the family, I said. Which family member provided you that information? Exactly. Gary's jaw tightened. Dad, what is this? We talked about this. You said you'd think about it. I did think about it, I said. I thought about it for 2 years, Gary. Ever since you first started asking me what the diner was worth. And I want you to hear something. Right here, in front of your sister and this young man and his leather folder. This building has never had your name on it. Not yours, not Renata's, not for one single day of the 41 years I've run it. You've been building a sale on a foundation that was never there. The color went right out of Gary's face, the way it does when a man's certainty meets a fact he never bothered to check. That's not possible, Dad. We talked about you signing it over. You always said. I said a lot of things, I said. Talking about doing something and doing it are two different animals, son, and you built your whole plan on the first one. I looked at Renata, whose eyes had gone bright and wet, though whether from shame or relief, I honestly couldn't tell you. Maybe both. Renata, honey, did you know that? Before you called me that Wednesday? She shook her head, small, and I believed her. Gary said it was basically done. He said it was just a formality, getting your signature. There is no formality, Otis Reyes said, stepping out from the back hallway where he'd been standing quiet the whole time, folder in hand, because I'd asked him to be there too, tucked out of sight, in case I needed him. There's an owner, and there's everybody else. Mr. Halloran, I'd strongly advise you get your firm's legal department on the phone before you leave this building today. Because what you've just done, listing a property, photographing it, and negotiating a sale price without verifying title, that's not just bad practice. Depending on how your paperwork's worded, that could be actionable. Chip Halloran had gone the color of the countertop. He started gathering his folder with hands that weren't quite steady. I need to make some calls, he said, and he was out the door inside of 90 seconds. Not even a goodbye, just the chime of the bell and his shoes on the sidewalk outside. Moving fast. Gary stood there in his expensive coat, in the middle of the diner he'd tried to sell out from under me. And for the first time in 2 years, I watched every bit of certainty drain right out of him. You knew, he said. This whole time. You let us. I let you show me exactly who you'd become, I said, and my voice cracked just slightly on that, more than I wanted it to. I gave you 2 years of quiet, Gary. 2 years of asking me questions that weren't really questions. And I kept hoping, every single time, that you'd come to me honest. Just once. Just say, Dad, I need help. Or Dad, I want this place someday. Or even Dad, I think you should retire. Any of that, I could have worked with. Instead, you brought a stranger with a camera into your mother's diner and started selling it before you'd even asked me straight to my face. Renata was crying now, quiet, the way she'd cried as a little girl when she thought she was in trouble. And Kurt had put an arm around her without saying a word, which I noticed and appreciated more than he probably knew. There's one more thing, I said, because I wasn't finished. Not yet. 8 months after we buried your mother, I bought a second building, 2 blocks from here, on Cedar Street. Neither one of you has ever set foot in it. Neither one of you has ever known it existed until this very second. It's held in a trust, and it has been for 6 years. And no broker, no listing agreement, no phone call from anybody in this family is ever going to touch it, because it was never built to be touched. It was built to be the thing I hand to whoever's left standing when this is all over. And standing the right way, not the fastest way, the right way. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Just the low hum of the coffee machine behind the counter and the sound of a car passing outside on Route 9. Dad, Gary finally said, and his voice had gone smaller than I'd heard it since he was maybe 12 years old. I'm sorry. I got in some trouble, financially, with the consulting thing, and I panicked. And I told myself I was doing right by everybody, but I wasn't. I know I wasn't. I looked at my son a long moment, 45 years old, standing in a diner that smelled like his whole childhood, finally telling the truth. I know you're sorry, I said. I believe you're sorry. But sorry doesn't undo 2 years of quiet manipulating your sister into thinking greed was just being practical. That's going to take longer than an apology in a diner on a Saturday morning. I want to tell you the rest plain, because I think you've earned it, staying with me this long. Chip Halloran's brokerage did call that same afternoon, and by the following week his firm had opened an internal review into how a listing had gone out without a title search, which is about as basic a step as exists in that whole profession. Last I heard from Otis, there was a formal complaint sitting with the State Real Estate Commission, and it wasn't one I'd filed. Seems the brokerage itself wanted no part of defending what their own agent had done. Gary's consulting troubles turned out to be real, deeper than I think even Deb fully knew. He came to me 3 weeks later, alone, no coat, no folder, just my son standing in my kitchen asking if we could talk honestly. For the first time, in longer than either of us wanted to admit, I didn't hand him money. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you listening might expect that's how this ends, and it isn't. What I gave him instead was 2 mornings a week, unpaid, back behind my counter, cracking eggs and pouring coffee, learning what it actually costs to keep a place like the Blue Wagon standing. He's 3 months into it now. It's not fixed, but it's honest. And honest is a place you can actually build something on, which is more than I can say for where he was standing before. Renata and I talk most Sundays now, longer calls than we used to have, the kind where neither one of us is in a hurry to hang up. She told me once, a few weeks after that Saturday, that she'd spent so many years being the peacekeeper in our family that she never noticed she'd become the messenger for somebody else's greed instead. I told her that took real courage to say out loud, and I meant it. As for Cedar Street, I finished the last of the wiring myself this past spring, on a string of quiet Sunday mornings, not so different from the ones I used to spend building the Blue Wagon, with Doris rolling her eyes at me from the doorway. I sat on the front step of that little brick building not long ago, coffee in hand, and I thought about her, the way I do most days now. You'd have had plenty to say about all this, Doris. You'd have told me I was too stubborn, too quiet, too much of a planner for my own good. Then you'd have handed me a sandwich and gone back to the books, because that's who you were, and that's how you loved me. The Blue Wagon still opens at 5 every morning, same as it has for 41 years. My name's still the only one on that deed, same as it always should have been. And 2 blocks over, on a quiet street most people in Millhaven have forgotten even exists, there's a building waiting for whoever proves, in the end, that they were standing there for the right reasons. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. I'll be right here when you come back.